My name is Claire. I'm 28 years old, and if you asked me a year ago whether I ever thought my family would fall apart over one careless comment, I would have laughed. But here I am, telling this story, because sometimes the words we throw out without thinking become the weight that breaks everything. I grew up in a small town where people's memories are longer than their lifespans. My brother, Jake, was the hero of this place. He was the star quarterback, the prom king, the boy who made grown men nod with approval and teenage girls swoon. Every diner, every corner store, every old neighbor still called him champ. He loved it. I, on the other hand, was just Jake's little sister. Claire, the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who stayed behind the scenes. I didn't mind. I knew who I was, the one who studied hard, went to college, came back home when mom got sick, and found a steady job as an administrative assistant in the town's medical clinic. Not glamorous, but solid. Jake didn't stay solid. He graduated high school with the world at his feet and never really landed. College didn't work out. He bounced from job to job, always dreaming big but never settling down. Every Thanksgiving dinner turned into a highlight reel of his big ideas, each one grander and more unrealistic than the last. At first, I thought it was charming. But as the years passed, it became exhausting. Dad was the glue that held everything together. He adored Jake, almost blindly, but he never neglected me. He used to say, "Claire, you're the quiet strength in this family. Never let anyone make you feel small." He died 2 years ago from a sudden heart attack, leaving a hole in our lives that never really healed. After Dad's passing, Jake moved back in with Mom. He said he wanted to help, but it was clear he was helping himself more than anyone else. He took over the living room with his late-night phone calls and vague business meetings over video chat. He made promises that he was working on something big, that soon we wouldn't have to worry about money. I worried anyway. I worried about Mom's health. I worried about the mortgage. I worried about the weight on my shoulders. I paid bills. I handled appointments. I made grocery lists. Jake made excuses. The town still worshipped him. People asked me about the big things Jake was working on. I'd smile politely and nod. But inside, I felt something hard and bitter building. I never intended to hurt him. I didn't even know the words were coming until they slipped out of my mouth. It was a Sunday dinner, one of those forced family moments where everyone pretends everything's fine. Jake was holding court again, telling Mom about a new venture, some app he was designing that would, in his words, revolutionize community engagement. I looked at him, really looked at him, and before I could stop myself, I said it. "Jake, you're a high school star who never moved on." The silence that followed was heavier than I ever imagined. His face twisted, not in anger at first, in hurt. Then it turned cold. He dropped his fork, pushed his chair back, and left the table without a word. I sat there, the echo of my words hanging in the air, knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Jake didn't come home that night. It wasn't the first time, but it felt different. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched plate of food in front of me. Mom had already gone to bed, her health declining more each day. I was left alone with my thoughts, the guilt slowly creeping in, mixing with the frustration I'd carried for years. The weeks following that dinner felt like they dragged on forever. Jake didn't show up for family meals. He didn't return my calls or texts. Every time I passed by the living room, I half expected him to be there, sitting on the couch with one of his cocky smiles, as though everything were fine. But it wasn't. I knew something had changed, and I wasn't sure if it was something I could fix. But life doesn't wait for anyone. Mom needed me more than ever. She struggled with getting out of bed some mornings, and I had to be the one to take care of everything. I handled her doctor's appointments, her medications, the paperwork that piled up, all while trying to keep my job at the clinic from falling apart. I found myself waking up earlier and going to bed later, and still, there was always something that needed to be done. Jake's absence left a hole, but it wasn't one I could fill. I wasn't sure if he even noticed. I told myself it wasn't worth it to dwell on his silence. He was just sulking, throwing a tantrum, like he always did when things didn't go his way. He was 32 years old, for God's sake. He needed to get over it. But the truth was, I was tired. I had spent my whole life looking after him, accommodating his moods, picking up the pieces when he didn't follow through on his promises. And now, after I spoke the truth for the first time, he couldn't handle it. He was a grown man, but in my eyes, he was still the same boy who refused to grow up. Then, one afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. The lawyer's name was unfamiliar to me, but the contents were anything but. It was the official paperwork regarding Dad's estate. The small house we grew up in, the land, and everything left behind had been tied up in legal matters after Dad's death. Mom hadn't been able to manage the process on her own, so I had stepped in. I assumed it would take a while for the dust to settle, but apparently, Jake had already taken the matter into his own hands. The letter explained that Jake had claimed his inheritance. His share was sizable enough to cover his debts, or so he thought. He had apparently used the funds for something, I didn't know what. What I did know was that he'd taken what was rightfully Mom's, what was rightfully mine. The house was supposed to be shared between us, to help Mom live comfortably, to keep the memories intact. But Jake didn't see it that way. He didn't care. I felt my chest tighten as I read through the details. He had taken the money, walked away, and left nothing but a cold emptiness in his wake. No explanation, no apology, just the cruel reality of his selfishness. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was the betrayal. It was the fact that my brother, the person I had spent my entire life trying to protect, didn't care about anyone but himself. That was the moment I realized I had been holding on to the idea of him as the brother I once admired, the one who had potential, the one who could make something of himself. But the truth was, he'd never cared about anyone else. He was the same high school star who never left his glory days behind, and I had spent too long pretending he had. 2 months passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the daily grind, keeping things running at the clinic, taking care of Mom, putting on a brave face for the few friends I had left in town. But everything felt different. Jake's absence was like a shadow that loomed over every moment, every conversation. Even when I was alone, I couldn't escape the quiet tension that hung in the air. I had learned to adjust to the silence of the house, the absence of his loud, over-the-top stories and careless jokes. But it was impossible to ignore the weight of the situation. I was doing everything I could to keep everything together, but Jake had taken more than just his share of the inheritance. He had taken the last thread of hope I had for our family. And that was the hardest part to swallow. The days felt longer. I had my moments of weakness, of course. Some nights, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice, wondering if there was more I could have done. I asked myself if I should have apologized, reached out, begged for forgiveness. But then I reminded myself that I had said what needed to be said. Jake needed to hear the truth. He needed to realize that we were all living in the real world now, and the sooner he accepted that, the better. But then, just when I thought I couldn't carry the burden anymore, Jake returned. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some grand gesture of reconciliation. One afternoon, I came home from work to find him sitting on the porch. It felt surreal, like seeing a ghost from my past, one that I had thought I'd buried long ago. He looked different, but then again, he didn't. There was the same familiar cockiness in his eyes, the same casual posture that made him seem untouchable. But there was something else, something darker. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't making jokes. He just sat there, waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't say anything at first. I stood there, staring at him, not sure how to react. After everything that had happened, everything he had done, I wasn't sure what he could possibly have to say. Finally, he spoke. "Claire," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know you're angry. I know you have every right to be. But I've been thinking about things. A lot of things. I crossed my arms, waiting for him to continue. Part of me wanted to yell at him, demand an explanation, but another part of me, the part that had always been the peacemaker, wanted to hear him out. I fucked up, he said quietly, his head hanging low. I know I did. And I know I hurt you. But you were right. I never moved on. I've been stuck, pretending like I could stay in high school forever, like the whole world was supposed to just bow down to me. But it doesn't work like that, does it? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jake, the man who had always been so full of himself, was admitting that he had been wrong. For a moment, I was speechless. But the hurt inside me, the years of resentment, came rushing back. I wanted to say something sharp, something cruel. But I stopped myself. I realized that this was the first time in years that Jake was finally seeing the truth, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to change. I'm sorry, he said again, looking up at me, his eyes filled with sincerity. I've been trying to make things right. I've been working on a plan, on my own. I just didn't want you to think I was still that person. I didn't want you to feel like I was using you or taking advantage of you. I felt a knot in my stomach. I had heard all this before, 100 times. But something in his tone, something in the way he spoke this time, felt different. It wasn't just words. It felt like he truly meant it. Where's the money, Jake? I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. Where did it go? He paused, looking away for a moment, like he was gathering the courage to say something he wasn't sure I'd want to hear. I used it, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. I used the inheritance to pay for treatments. I've been sick, Claire. I've had cancer for the last 6 months. I didn't want anyone to know, especially not you. I didn't want you to see me like this. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what he had just said. Jake had cancer? The same man who had always been invincible in my eyes, the one who thought he could coast through life without ever facing any consequences, was dying? I didn't know what to say. How could I possibly respond to that? I didn't know what to say at first. My mind raced as I processed Jake's words, the reality of his illness slowly sinking in. I stood frozen on the porch, unsure if I was supposed to comfort him, or if I was angry, or if I was supposed to feel something else entirely. Jake had always been the strong one, the one who never needed help, the one who didn't let anyone in. And now, here he was, a shadow of the man I'd known, asking for forgiveness, and I didn't know what to do with that. He looked at me, waiting for a response, and for a moment, I just stared at him. The man who had always been the center of attention, who had taken everything for granted, was now admitting his vulnerability. It was almost too much to take in. You're serious? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded slowly, his eyes dark with exhaustion. Yeah. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know. But I couldn't keep lying anymore. I sat down next to him on the porch, feeling the weight of everything pressed down on me. Jake, the man who had spent years acting like life was one big game, was now facing his mortality. It was hard to wrap my mind around. How had we gotten here? How had he gotten here? I didn't know how to fix things, Jake continued, his voice shaking slightly. I thought if I just kept going, kept pretending, it would all somehow work out. But it didn't. And now I'm running out of time. I don't know what to do anymore. I could feel the anger still simmering inside me, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been. His words, his confession, had cut through the walls I'd built around myself. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him how much he had hurt me, how much he had taken from our family. But I also understood something in that moment. We were both stuck in a cycle of denial and pain, and now, we had to face the truth. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, finally finding my voice. Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have helped you. We could have been there for you. Jake looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. I didn't want to be weak. I didn't want you to see me like this, Claire. You've always been the strong one. I didn't want to disappoint you. His words stung more than I cared to admit. I had spent my entire life watching him get away with everything, from the way he coasted through high school to the way he squandered his opportunities. And now, here he was, telling me that he didn't want me to see him as weak? It felt like a slap in the face. You didn't think I'd be disappointed because you're sick? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. You thought I'd be disappointed because you've been living in some kind of fantasy world while the rest of us had to deal with reality? Jake winced, the guilt evident in his eyes. I know, Claire. I know I messed up. But I couldn't face it. I couldn't face the fact that I had nothing to show for all these years. That I wasted my life and didn't have anything to offer. I didn't know how to be the person I was supposed to be. The person you always needed me to be. I shook my head, trying to understand, trying to make sense of it all. Jake, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be this star from high school. I never needed you to be anything other than my brother. But you've been running from everything, from our family, from the truth, from yourself. And now, you've hurt Mom. You've hurt me. You've hurt all of us. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just didn't know how to make it right. I didn't know how to fix it. For the first time in a long time, I felt the anger begin to ebb away. I could see it in his eyes, the genuine regret, the desire to do better, even if it was too late. I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive him for everything he had done, but in that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about giving ourselves permission to move forward. You're right, I said quietly. You didn't know how to fix it. But maybe you can start by being honest. By owning up to your mistakes. And by actually doing something for Mom. She deserves that. Jake nodded, his eyes brimming with tears. I know. I'm sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what the future held for Jake or for our family. But in that moment, I realized that healing didn't happen in a single conversation. It happened in the small steps, the moments of truth, the willingness to try. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, I believed that we could figure it out, together. The weeks that followed Jake's return were a whirlwind of emotions. At first, I couldn't tell whether we were just putting on a facade of family or if we were genuinely trying to heal. We were awkward, hesitant, each of us testing the waters, unsure of how to move forward after so much had been broken. Jake did his best to show he was trying. He made small gestures, like cooking dinner for Mom, helping with the bills, and offering to help around the house. It wasn't the grand gesture I had imagined when I thought about him coming back. It wasn't even an apology that would fix everything. But it was something. I watched him closely, trying to decipher if his actions were just a temporary fix, if he was really committed to changing. But I knew better now than to expect anything easy or immediate. Trust had to be rebuilt, and that wasn't something you could rush. The hardest part, though, wasn't Jake's return. It was seeing my mom's reaction. Mom had always been the one who saw the good in people, the one who believed that things could get better with enough time. But as I watched her, I saw the cracks in her hope. She was trying to forgive him. She wanted to believe that her son, the one she had raised, was back and ready to make things right. But I could see the hesitation in her eyes. I could feel the pain in her silence when she looked at him. One night, after dinner, Jake and I were sitting outside on the porch, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The sun had set, and the stars were just beginning to show, but the air felt heavy, like there was something unsaid between us. I know you don't trust me, Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost like he was afraid to say the words out loud. I know you're still angry with me. And I get it. But I'm trying. I'm trying to do better, Claire. I don't want to lose this family. I don't want to lose Mom. And I don't want to lose you. His words caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that he had really changed, but another part of me couldn't shake the past. The way he had taken what wasn't his, the way he had ignored all the people who cared about him, I couldn't just forget that. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay after he had walked away and taken so much with him. I don't know if I can trust you again, Jake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You've hurt Mom. You've hurt me. And you've hurt yourself by not being honest. I'm not sure if I can just forgive and forget. I'm not sure if you're the person you say you are now. Jake looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. It was clear that my words had struck a chord, but I could see the resolve in his eyes. He wasn't backing down, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he said after a long pause. I don't even know if I deserve another chance. But I'm here. I'm trying. And I want to make things right, even if it's too late. Even if you can't forgive me, I'll do whatever it takes to prove I can be better. There was a heaviness in the air, but there was also something else, a sliver of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Jake was trying. He wasn't the same person who had walked away all those months ago. And I could see that. But forgiveness wasn't something that could be forced. It had to come on its own. Later that evening, I spoke to Mom in the quiet of the kitchen, the weight of everything finally catching up to me. I had spent so much time holding on to the anger, holding on to the resentment, that I hadn't given myself the chance to feel everything else, the hurt, the sadness, the fear. I didn't know what the future held, but I realized that there was something more important than holding on to the past, healing. Mom, I said softly, my voice breaking. I don't know if we'll ever be the family we were before, but I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose him either. We've been through so much, and I don't know what happens next. But I don't want to keep living in anger. Mom looked at me, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She took a deep breath and nodded slowly. I don't know if he's the same person he used to be, but I want to believe that he can change. I want to believe that we can be a family again. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight of the past lift, just a little bit. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild what we had lost. The next day, we all sat down together, Mom, Jake, and me. We didn't have a grand plan or a perfect solution. But we had each other. And sometimes, that was enough to start over. Slowly, we began to put the pieces back together. There were no guarantees, no promises of an easy road ahead. But in that moment, we were trying. And that was enough to make me believe that, despite everything, maybe we could find a way to move forward. Subscribe to our channel for powerful real stories that touch your heart. Join a community where emotions run deep and every story brings a new perspective. Don't miss out, hit that bell for weekly updates.